Hi, I'm Annapolis Mayor Josh Cohen with your weekly update. Today is Wednesday, March 3rd, 2010, and I want to spend this entire update talking about the budget. And I say that seriously because it's a very difficult budget this year. I'm going to be submitting my proposed fiscal year 2011 budget to the City Council this coming Monday night, March 8th. That budget, as you have no doubt heard by now, is going to include cuts in expenses, cuts in some services, as well as cuts in positions of employees, which is the first time that the City of Annapolis has had to do that in anyone's memory. I want to share a little bit about how we got into this situation, because the question I hear all the time is, Josh, how did we go from a balanced budget just a few months ago when everything's fine to facing a $9 million plus deficit in just a few short months? And the answer is, last year we did have a balanced budget. In May of last year, the City Council adopted a balanced budget for this current fiscal year 2010. The city is required by law to have a balanced budget. The way it balanced the budget is by relying in part on $4.5 million of surplus money from the previous year, which was one-time money to the city. It wasn't $4.5 million in ongoing tax revenue or fee revenue. It was one-time money that was carried over from the previous year. That is money that we do not have moving forward to next year because we don't have a surplus. We're in a deficit. So right out of the starting gate, as I'm putting together my proposed budget for next year, I have a $4.5 million shortfall to make up. In addition, a number of revenues that the city had projected, even projecting conservatively a year ago, a number of those revenues have come in under budget. And I want to share briefly some of those. $1.4 million shortfall in state highway user revenue, $400,000 shortfall in state aid for police protection, almost $500,000 shortfall in building permit revenue, $300,000 down in city dock revenue from the boat shows and moorings, $300,000 down in hotel tax revenue, $300,000 down in income tax revenue. Other revenues are down even below projections. Red light camera fines are down. Parking garage rate fees are down. So in the context of an $86.5 million spending plan, which the City Council adopted for this year, $4.5 million of that was one-time money that we don't have moving forward. And on top of that, our revenues are coming in under budget by more than $3 million. So that's how we went from a balanced budget to about a $2.5 million deficit even within this fiscal year, and then another $6.5 million deficit moving into next fiscal year. Now that deficit is actually growing as we get more and more projections coming in, but that's the basics of how we got from a balanced budget to this tremendous deficit. Now there's only two ways to close a budget deficit. You either reduce expenses, or you increase revenues, or you do a combination. Our options to increase revenues are limited. Property tax makes up 62.5% of city revenues. I've ruled out a property tax increase. I think this is the wrong time for a property tax increase, particularly when residents and businesses are struggling just to pay the bills they have. That leaves two other options: increased fees, and we are looking at increasing some fees to more accurately cover the cost of providing services, and increased grants. And we've hired a grants coordinator who is aggressively pursuing additional grant money. But fees and grants can only increase revenue so much. They can't make up an $8 to $9 million budget deficit, which leaves us with no other option but reducing expenses. Now, there are some relatively painless expenses we can reduce. I've cut money for Sister Cities program, for the City of Annapolis magazine, for the Arts and Public Places Commission. We have, immediately after taking office, we directed all department heads to hold off any contracts, even ones that had already been approved, to hold off making expenses, even ones that have already been approved. We instituted a hiring freeze, which has saved us several $100,000. and we have worked with our department heads and employees to do a much better job of managing overtime, and we're on track to save about $100,000 a month just by better managing overtime. So we're doing a lot to manage our expenses. But the problem is when almost 85% of our budget is personnel, and over $10 million of our budget is debt service, like a mortgage payment, which we can't even touch. There's no way to close a budget deficit of this magnitude without affecting personnel. My administration is asking for concessions from unions, but even assuming about $2 million in concessions, which in itself is unprecedented, we still have about $4 million to go to close this budget deficit, which is why I have no other choice but to eliminate positions. The budget I will be submitting to the City Council Monday night will eliminate about 90 to 95 positions. About 35 of those are vacant, but that means about 55 have employees in them, which means that a number of good people, dedicated employees, are going to be losing their jobs through no fault of their own. So this is a very difficult budget year, not only for the employees who will be losing their jobs, but for the employees who will be remaining, as well as for taxpayers and citizens who also will feel some impact on services. The budget process has been an ongoing discussion. Earlier this week I held 2 public budget forums, one at Georgetown East Elementary, one last night at Mount Olive Community Life Center, to present how we're looking at closing this budget deficit, and also to receive ideas and suggestions and input from the public. This budget discussion will continue even after I submit the proposed budget on March 8th. Once I submit the budget, the City Council's Finance Committee will then take responsibility for it. It will review it line by line, just like I have for the past few weeks. It will meet with every department director, just like I have, so it will do its own review of every expense proposed in that budget. The Finance Committee will hold its own hearings. It'll go back to the full City Council. The Council will hold its own hearings. And ultimately, the City Council will adopt a budget probably mid to late May. So the first step of this budget process will come this Monday night when I submit my administration's proposed budget. But the budget process, the discussions, the debates will continue for another couple months. And I encourage everybody to be part of that discussion, to participate, to be engaged, because this budget discussion is probably the most important discussion the City Council will be having, because it affects all aspects of our quality of life for all Annapolitans. Thank you for your time.